right now.
Okay.
It's 30 seconds, 20 seconds.
As long as you don't see.
Good afternoon, Laura Van Tosh. My name is Kevin Fitz. I'm the host of Fittsian Dialogues. We are here again another Saturday at noon for fascinating conversations with friends and colleagues and just interesting people. I want to introduce Laura Van Tosh from the state above us, Washington. Hello, Laura. How's it going?
Good to see you, Kevin. I'm good.
Nice.
How about you?
Good, good. Nice to see you. Nice to see you.
Sure.
So Laura and I have known each other for quite a while. I'm going to let Laura talk a little bit about her experience and some of her background. But my first experience of meeting Laura Van Tosh was at a place called Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1990. Tell us a little bit about what was going on there, what role you had, and what is, this is the context for viewers, particularly my work as a mental health advocate and legislative lobbyist is around progressive and humane reform. And a lot of that work is in what people may now call the peer movement or the psychiatric survivor consumer movement. So I met Laura at a convention back there in 1990. Tell us a little bit about yourself and then maybe go into what was going on back there and what your role was.
Okay. Well, it's really great to be here. I have to say, it's just really great to be alive and to be in recovery and to be surrounded by so many people like you, Kevin, not only in Washington, but in different parts of the country, including Oregon, my former home, who are really marching the march and getting some great things accomplished. I was at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, right? At a national conference called Alternatives. And I don't remember the number it was, but we've been meeting for at least 30 years every year, funded originally by SAMHSA, and now funded in different ways, including at a grassroots level. And I was actually part of the emergency team at the conference just to make sure that people were doing well, if they needed any support. I mean, called it emergency team, but really the biggest issue was to provide peer support for people who hadn't attended a conference like that in a long time or ever. And it was really sort of overwhelming for new people because people hadn't really heard about peer support, peer run programs, advocacy, things like eliminating stigma, discrimination, and really having a whole lot of people. I think that there were over 1,000 people there at that conference. So I was part of I think a team of maybe 6 or 8 people. And I know Paolo Del Vecchio at the time was the lead on the conference. So we didn't get a lot of sleep over the 3 or 4 days, but we had a really good time. And fortunately, the only other thing that sticks in my mind was that the biggest issue that people had was that they left their medication at home. So we had relationships with the behavioral healthcare system in Pittsburgh, and were able to get support if we needed, primarily refills basically. And, if people needed them or wanted them or asked, we certainly weren't a drugstore, but we were supportive in helping people get what their needs were, get their needs met during that period. And it was just really a great conference with so many things happening around the country at that time. It was really a burgeoning period in our history.
Yeah, I remember on the plane there, I was like, okay, so the shy guy routine's not going to buy it. You don't know anybody here. I want you to do as much. Hello, how are you? My name is Kevin. Hello, how are you? My name is Kevin. Because if not, you're going to have a crummy time. You're going to be complaining how lonely you are. I had a fantastic time. You said there are 1,000 people or so there. I must have met 400 people at that conference, just constantly introducing myself to people. It was I had been to other conferences like Episcopal youth conferences and other conferences before, but just the vibe of the acceptance level just felt, communal and warm and And it was just and the dance was it was just a great, it was a great experience.
It really was. I was living in Philadelphia, actually. So you flew in and we took the train, and it was actually I don't know, 8-hour train ride or something. I remember it was a pretty long train ride, but it was really a beautiful university. I have some images, but it's a little hard to remember everything. And it was actually, I think, one of the last times, excuse me, that it was held on a college campus.
Yeah, yeah.
Future meetings were held at hotels. It was a whole different kind of scenario. And I think people with behavioral health care issues were able to access scholarships to stay in the hotels, that we ended up having more traditional conferences held at the hotels. So, but it was a really great experience. I'm glad I was a part of it.
What was it? What was this collection of advocates and the people who were helping to put on, with the federal government's subsidy, these national mental health consumer peer psychiatric survivor conferences? What did they identify themselves at? I mean, how did you, Laura Van Tosh, advocate and policy senior policy sort of advisor to a whole lot of folks, how did you get engaged or discover this? Because it's not actually something that a lot of people happen on, that easily, and especially 30 years ago.
Well, and you could say now, especially without Facebook, quite frankly, it wasn't, I don't even remember if I had a computer at that time. I don't think we did. Late 80s, I was hired by the organization that that sponsored the conference. And it was actually a national clearinghouse, the National Consumer Self-Help Clearinghouse. And they still actually put out a newsletter that's accessible, and people who might be watching today may have seen it on Facebook. It's often posted through Facebook. And it's sponsored by another national center, so it's remained a viable publication. And so I was directing a street outreach program at the time when I got connected to the conference. And we were all in one big office with a number of different programs under one roof, at least a dozen or so of well-funded, distinct programs funded by the state, the federal government, the city of Philadelphia, perhaps some private foundations, but an entire, panoply, if I'm saying that word right, of programs that became, that was under another umbrella called Project Share. So we were all operating under this pretty cool umbrella that reminded me of the 60s, actually, because of its collective nature, and how we functioned and how we came to decisions and how we collaborated with each other on different programs while we were working our programs, our independent programs. So at a later point, I was working with the clearinghouse, and then I left and went to the DC area. But at the point of being in Philadelphia, how that happened was meeting the founder of Project Share and then the director of the clearinghouse, one person, Joseph Rogers. And and I have to say, I knew him as Joe. So later, it's been a little bit of, it's funny how that's been an adjustment, because I sort of see him that way as Joe, but Joseph today. And he really left an impression on so many people that he gave opportunities to, and met me in Seattle, which is where I am now. And then I went back east and worked in Philadelphia with him. And it was truly an opportunity of a lifetime. It was like, I never thought that I would drop what I was doing and get on a plane at the age of 25 and go to Philadelphia, which was kind of a rough and tumble city compared to where I'd lived.
Was there some understanding that you were going to work for an organization that people were, quote unquote, out of the closet of having mental and emotional challenges, that you were going to have coworkers, and maybe that might be something that you were asked whether you self-identify, or was that part of your knowledge base when you were looking at going out there?
Well, I was invited to go to Philly. I was I guess you could say he recruited me to direct again the street outreach program. And absolutely, I was already just getting involved in the peer movement, that then consumer survivor ex-patient movement. And at that time, it was clear that if I interviewed, for example, that I was coming out during that process, and that the entire agency, as it was described, were all of us were people who had experienced extreme states, involuntary commitment, psychiatric hospitalization, and that we were people in recovery, and many of us still using services, which I was, and many other people that I worked together with. And so, yes, it was actually an opportunity to go to sort of a conglomerate of programs that celebrated, and and it wasn't easy, even with the city of Philadelphia maybe not certainly embracing our experiences as it was back then, but we really had an impact. And I have to say that Joseph Rogers was a charismatic leader,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
solid to the core in terms of values. He was my mentor. And so it wasn't hard to learn from him if you just even stopped and listened, or trailed behind and watched. And it was infused in all of the work that we did. And that's really where I got, as they say, the figure of speech, where I cut my teeth.
Yeah. 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 It was interesting because I went in 1988, a gentleman who had helped me with a better transition from the state hospital system into a better supportive housing turned out to be an individual who identified back then as a person who was a recovering alcoholic and a manic depressive, who was key as with a few other folks named Mike Libacek and Jerry Wang in helping support what I thought initially was just a community center for people with mental and emotional challenges and suffering extreme states. And it turned out to be, which was the twist, which I didn't really know about and wasn't something I was initially comfortable talking about on a public level. Like, these people are running this drop-in center, this community center that's open 10 hours a day for people who are identifying as struggling with mental and emotional challenges in extreme states. Oh, but then also the staff is all identifying, yes, I've been down that road. Yes, I'm a fellow traveler. Yes, I've had this challenge of been psychiatrically labeled and suffered with moods and thoughts and challenges, and was eye-opening. So went from completely uninitiated in 1988 to meeting Joseph Rogers and Judy Chamberlain and Howie the Harp and Sally Zinman. These, in this movement, which I still like to call the consumer survivor movement, we can get to how we use language around peers or what that means. But I do think that there's something distilled in me around these first generation elders who brought forth the issues of civil rights, consumer choice, sometimes the least coercive intervention is may always be, not always, but may be the best. And sometimes, and meeting these people were like folk heroes, in my culture, particularly Joseph Rogers. In the later years, when I was doing some technical assistance for a mental health consumer project in Oregon, I have many, many heroes throughout that I've met in the last 30 years of doing this, but there's nobody who taught me, save for probably you, my dear colleague and friend, the navigation between the state legislature, the Office of Mental Health Services at your state, and the governor's office, about when you find yourself to be a ping pong ball or they're very happy to see you one day to support their initiative, but when you're, to help me politically navigate those sort of things, that is just a genius. And helping co-support a tiny little 8-person, 10-person group into a 300 plus organization, and employed an awful lot of BIPOC people and people, mental health consumers as well, just as amazing. So.
Right. Well, one of the premises of the street outreach program, Project Oats. It was like oatmeal, but is outreach, advocacy, and training services for people who are homeless and mentally disabled. Was to actually hire people from the streets after folks got together and got their lives in some order, back to work on Project Oats. And
Yeah.
so we actually hired people from the streets to the outreach team,
Yeah.
you know, with the period of time of making sure people had a place to live. I wouldn't hire anyone who didn't have a place to live, because that to me was the cornerstone of recovery. And you can't get up and go to work if you're not getting up somewhere. And so there were a couple of people actually who have always remained in my mind and memory, who were literally hired from a dumpster that became outreach specialist or assistant director of the program itself, and even someone who had been homeless who took my role when I moved on to work with the clearinghouse at the
Yeah.
time. And that's really a big part of the peer movement, actually, is to really pass on
Yeah.
and pass it on and support people as they take on new roles, and really key to you know, keeping these issues afloat. And I mean, just the idea of being able to hire someone who was homeless 2 weeks ago into a job with a paycheck, you know, is really kind of the it's it. You know, it's like that's what it's about.
So speaking of switching roles, I met you just initially, not very long, but I met you in 1990 at this conference. Then I went back to one of these pilot projects that the national, that the federal government funded. I think 8 of them or 9 of them demonstration projects, and this one was over here in Portland on 30th and Belmont. And then I was then reconnected, or you were reintroduced in my life. You and another person were doing some research or some analysis or doing interviews. So you had moved on, or were moonlighting, doing something after you left the clearinghouse. Tell us a little bit some of that experience, and because I think I have a paperback or
Yeah.
a trade paperback of some of the work that you did back then.
Well, actually, your program was one of 13 that were funded together. And it was a huge deal at the federal level, which was that they funded in one, you know, baker's dozen peer-run programs in one fell swoop. That was something that took a huge amount of effort. And I was invited to produce a report to summarize those programs. And so I had a contract with SAMHSA to develop a report and come up with some findings as a result of looking at all 13 programs. And it was a partnership with Paolo Del Vecchio, and he and I completed the report together over a period of time, and it was published in 2000. And one was up here in Washington, actually, and the woman who started it is now in Hawaii, and she's doing a lot of really great work. Kathleen Miriam Rose in Hawaii, and she started a clubhouse program in Washington. And then Yours Yes with Mind Empowered, and there were, again, the other that made up this group. And really what was helpful about this program was, the report itself was to really see what the issues are, because peer-run programs were kind of dropping like flies sometimes, and they weren't well funded in terms of administrative costs, and there were management issues and functional issues that we were able to identify. And then right after that, the federal government actually funded another group many years later, but another batch of consumer operated services, they called them. It was called the COSP program, and that you can actually search on SAMHSA, I believe it's there. And so these 13 programs actually informed the next group of programs. And so that was really important, that the feds were able to have a progression for these services and programs. And that's really the way it kind of should be. It's not always, it doesn't always happen that way, but with even other programs where the reports and monographs that go on bookshelves sometimes really are being done for a reason, and they're
Yep.
being done to inform quality and accountability and report out important policy gleanings.
Yeah, I agree. It's almost like the scaffolding of the past. We move it forward. This generation takes on, the work or the creation that was started previous to us. Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting you say management issues, because one of the biggest challenges, particularly, is not that is not for lack of good ideas. It's not lack of earnestness. It's not lack of compassion, or people doing it for the right reasons. However, like you talked about, the person who in the dumpster 2 weeks later has got a paid job. There is this particular a sensitive issue in the peer movement, and a lot of that is the effective management of financial legal corporations. So it's these, you talk about some of the values of sort of supporting or people who are identifying have coming from challenged background, or difficulties, mental and emotional and extreme states. But some people come into these roles with a great amount of personal moxie or charisma. However, they're not business experts at managing a board of directors when 51% of them are self-identified. And we have, and how do we participate as this kind of structure? And that has long been, I think, our Achilles heel, at least here on the west, and in Oregon. How do you function as a community and as a nonprofit organization tied into such a movement, but also need to be sophisticated in your?
Well, I think today, if you don't mind me saying, there's another, now I think because of the early work on these programs, and there were problems, and I don't want to sugarcoat that, but I also, is realize that we have other resources now that support the sustenance of these programs. We have consulting agencies, bookkeeping, firms and administrative support organizations that can provide help. And really every state and county around the country, I'm sure, has a different model for their peer-run programs. But I think oh, I know what I was going to say too, is that in terms of policy, by the way, that even the RFPs and things coming out of SAMHSA changed. Because of some of these issues, there needed to be certain things in place, better HR issues covered, a whole host of other things that I think have been built into granting agencies now, so that there's some guardrails and support provided to these peer-run programs. Also, please remember that there are people who are highly skilled and talented in management, then had behavioral health care issues and were off the grid for a while, and then came back and have been able to use those skills. MBAs and all kinds of other people that have had professional backgrounds that can come back and manage a program, so it's not linear. So at any rate, but I did want to tell you that project of the 13 programs was really at a deficit, in that we reviewed paper. We were not, given frequent flyer miles to fly to these 13 programs.
Right.
It really does happen nowadays. You can do site visits and stuff, but we were given files and, some phone numbers, but not as many. And our report was really a retrospective, with paper. And so there were some, challenges, and that's explained in terms of our methodology of how we were able to accomplish it. But now, and then from there, I really started getting involved in policy. I was kind of always doing policy work in some way or another. When I directed the street outreach program, I was appointed to a federal task force on homelessness. And that's when I really saw how, the structure of solving these problems was occurring or not at the federal level. So
For time frame, when were you appointed to that National Council on Homelessness?
It was the it was 90, I think, maybe a year before. And that was really the first time that people with behavioral health care issues were invited to serve on something like that. And I was the only person self-identified, and what I ended up doing, and I was like, well, give me my round trip ticket back. I don't mind. Is I convinced them that uh, to have a group, there was a subcommittee on peer run programs for people who were homeless.
Wow.
And I think 8 or 9 people. I just ordered the report because I lost my original copy, and you can only get it on Amazon. Anyhow, it's weird, but um, I saw the people they had directories of who was on what group, and so those were the days where I didn't know a lot, but I knew that I wasn't going to be the only one.
Right, right.
And I'm telling you, I'm friends with the woman who said yes on Facebook. She said, yes, go ahead and get some people together. And we did it. And Celia Brown was one of those folks. A couple of people have passed away, but there are several people who are still around that were part of that group. And that was the first time I met Celia. Was during that was actually it was the late 80s, because the group met in 88, the subgroup, if you will. And we were able to infuse the final report with our perspective. I mean, and that too, it sounds easier than it was, but it was not. But it was certainly an exciting moment
Yeah,
to be
yeah.
able to have that happen.
Let's I want to make time for question and answers, and I explicitly want to talk about some of the important work that you're doing in Washington and some of your thoughts about that. What if there's anything else that comes to your mind that you want to share of, sort of historical? One of the things around that that's very intriguing, and another one of that, sometimes my friends have ideas where like I should have thought of that. Tell us, so speaking a little bit more about policy, you developed something called a policy roundtable, or I don't know if you developed it or you took it over from somebody else, but tell us a little bit about what that was and what the founding idea of that was. And because that was very interesting, because I didn't know a whole lot of people talking about. I go to the national conferences or regional conferences for 25 years. Very little people, very few. I mean, even at our, God bless our, our Oregon homegrown, now international Peer Apocalypse, we'll have 55 workshops, and we'll have 2 on political advocacy, understanding how to get a bill passed, all of that sort of stuff, or even talking to the academic community and getting them into support. So tell me a little bit about that roundtable and what that was, how that became, if you don't mind, and then we'll go into the more present.
Okay, terrific. Well, in DC, it became, when I lived in Washington, DC, it became really apparent that that some of the people who had been around the policy world, which are really professional advocates, frankly, you're just advocating for something. And so advocate is really a broad term here. And they were either passing away or they were retiring and playing golf. And they were, I'm sort of really overgeneralizing, but it's true that they were like gone and they were moving on. And it occurred to me at a conference, everything happens at a conference in DC, it seems, it occurred to me at a conference that, where's this knowledge base going? It's vanishing. And I want to know what happened in 1960 with John F. Kennedy and the Community Mental Health Center Act. And I know that Clark Ross knows about that because he may have just started his career back then. And Ron Manderscheid was working in the field at that point, or maybe a few years later. And so just by way of that, I think I brought together, it was on my own and it's still around, but it left DC and was dormant for quite a while, but it brought together essentially, I call veterans of the policy world, people who have been working in the field for quite a long time, together with newcomers. And newcomers are, at that point, were people like me for sure, and even now, new at other things that I'm completely oblivious to. And newcomers were people who were junior policy aides or going to graduate school and studying public policy, or working for a trade association as a junior level policy analyst. And I had that title at one point. So people that were not sort of in charge of government affairs, but people beneath that rung, and young people again. And so we came together around a table in different parts of the city, starting in 1998 through 2005. And it was funded by a small grant from the MacArthur Foundation, which came through a network grant that my boss and mentor at the time, Howard Goldman, had a large network grant from the MacArthur Foundation on behavioral healthcare. And there was a small piece of that that was used for me to do the roundtable. And I monitored the grant and submitted reports, and it was like an adjunct piece. And I was grateful because it was, again, foundation funding is sort of the best because you're not worried about, certain issues that sometimes you have to worry about with federal or state funding. And so we met in, every other month for 8 years. And
Did you publish policy briefs?
yeah, we produced, I did quick summaries of meetings. The main purpose too was less, outcome on paper and more process. And that was that people were asked to take their hat off when they came to a meeting. And it was a lunchtime meeting. We all bonded around our lunch. Everyone eats. We're all basically human. And then we kept our hats off for wherever we worked. The American Psychiatric Association, NAMI, whatever the organizations were, you take your hat off and you're not really working there as part of the roundtable, which was not actually always easy. And then we'd have a guest speaker and have a provocative, not a speech, but more of a discussion brief and kickoff of a dialogue on a certain issue. And again, remembering the younger people that would know very little about, let's say, the roots of deinstitutionalization. Like, what is that? I have to say it. I finally know how to spell it, but I don't really know what it is.
Right.
And so we'd have a dialogue about that, and there'd be maybe one or two people that would be quote guest speaker. And it was always very provocative and would sort of leave people hanging. And the hanging piece was mostly, let's have a discussion about this. And there was no difficulty in doing that. And I pretty much selected the topics. I had a small steering committee that I ran the topics by, or they would be a discussant if I needed someone. And it flowed well. And I had an AOL email address, and
was it always the same return players for the most part for the 8 years?
No. The thing about it happening there, there'd be some people that always came because they were retired, they liked it, it gave them a reason, kind of a reason to, not to live, but, people that were still tied to the field and, really like a security. Everyone was always welcome, but it was also,
I'm going to be like that. I'm going to be hanging on to policy discussions on my deathbed,
And it was so, we went to the Bazelon Center and had our meeting there. And actually the host, we'd go in I'd find different conference rooms around the city. And the host would always have drinks out for people. And it was really nice, and no one had to do anything, but that's what they did. And then we had a 5-year event at the Capitol, actually, with some congressmen that spoke at the 5-year mark, which was really kind of a big deal.
Wow.
It was, all I remember is it was August and 130 degrees with the humidity. And I was dressed up carrying food, through a parking lot. And by the time I got to our room, I was a wreck.
Well, that's an important, just like I said earlier, we have this consumer peer movement, survivor movements going on for 45 plus years. The understanding of the engagement about how to make policy, how to make law, how to build relationships with academics and researchers. So the professional esteem.
And they want to learn from
Dr.
us.
Goldman has for you, at least, is like, wow, that's impressive. And and thank you for doing that. You know, I hope it inspires other people to say, maybe we need something like that in my region or in my state, or, you know, whatever.
Well,
So
it's happening now in King County, but it's not happening at any frequency, regular frequency. Number one, I tried it here and people didn't know what my point was. And so it's kind of interesting how it did not fit here. But now it's less about the table and more of a formal presentation.
yeah,
So I've had three of them, I think three, and one on Zoom that went really well around research with a peer researcher and two other researchers, and a facilitator, David Wertheimer, who used to work with the Gates Foundation, facilitative. And
wow.
it was neat to do it that way, and I'm going to try to keep that up. But it'll be, you know, infrequent infrequent meetings.
Yeah.
That's the way I'm posing
Well,
it.
very interesting. So one of the goals for this is not just to have a good conversation with people that I admire, but also for history, for people who might like, oh wow, it's interesting to understand some of those puzzle pieces. So let's talk about the tour de force that has been, you know, the consumer and peer movement in Washington, and, you know, some of your work up there, and let's sort of bring it in the present, unless there's anything historically that you think, gosh, I wish people remembered this or knew that or whatever. But I'd like to get into the work that you've been doing in Washington.
Okay. I do want to call out one person from the past, and he's not with us anymore. But although I always say that Howie lives, Howie the Harp played a huge role in my work, and he was just a leader, so much like Joseph Rogers. So I just want to mention him as someone who saw me through major periods of the early years, and left his mark not only in California, definitely, but in New York City.
Yeah.
So he was
And in
really,
Oregon. And in
and in
Oregon, one of the
Oregon, you're
four
right.
founders of the Insane Liberation Front.
That's right. I forgot
Yeah.
about that. Yeah. So
I met him in 1991 at this mind empowered mental health consumer survivor drop-in center. My boss at the time said, these guys are radicals. This guy is a radical psych survivor. He rails against the violence in, you know, commercial and industry, in, you know, psychiatry. These people are not working within the system, so you want to beware. 18 months later, he's the chief of security for the conference that I was running and organizing in Berkeley in Alternatives 91. Amazing. Another person, just the strength of their charisma, plus their heart, plus some sort of
mhm,
power in the way they're
yeah,
and networking
yeah,
people.
yeah,
Just
absolutely.
amazing. Yeah.
So what's happening now? I just want to first say that I came back here from Oregon. Actually, I went from Oregon to Washington State in 2015. But I had lived here early on, as I mentioned before, and I worked at
Are
Western.
you a Washingtonian by birth?
No, 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 no. No. Miami, Florida. That's why I left, because
Oh,
it's so
okay.
far
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
But yeah. I came back here in 2015 after having a huge situation in my life around mental health concerns and homelessness, and also involvement with the criminal justice system. And now free and clear, thank goodness, and on the road to recovery still. But in 15 came back, and I realized that the peer movement had, there were some newer people and some programs that had been here when I left, and were operating and still doing really well, and some new programs. But one thing that, I think is pretty common around the country is people with behavioral health care issues, I think, are a little hesitant to work at the legislative level. I think it's less common, but I think there are now more and more places that more and more peers that are. But
Well, so why is that less common, that, because we have 6,000 certified peers in Oregon, probably, roughly, addiction peers and
yeah,
behavioral health or mental health peers, peer
I
support
think it's kind
specialists.
of the last bastion. I think also, to be frank with you, more people are mostly concerned with themselves. In that, my benefits and my TANF and my Section 8, and believe me, hello, yes, those are crucial things to be worried about and to be concerned with, and even quote my job,
Right,
and
right, right.
so by and large, I'm talking again about something that's very human, that we all tend to be concerned about what's closest to us, and I think that the idea of looking a little bit further out, if we view it more as a circular, rings of concern or what have you, that I
But it
think,
always amazes me that, so we have 6,000 peers. Apparently, most of them either want to work or we're hoping to work in the system as a peer doing individual, services, community services,
yeah,
or in reach or outreach. Though one of the things I always try to put in your head is, where do you think that program got created in the first place to give you those funds? I mean, somebody had to
mhm,
make a law and to approve funding, unless, I mean, unless you're talking about private grants or donations, some government had to make some law and approve the funding of this project, you know, and if we don't get involved in that game or in those processes, we're not going to be able to get, what our share of the pie is. I mean, I don't think that, maybe that's not the right way to say it, but that, and that was lost on me. Oh, not always. I always wanted to figure out how to do it. I did not meet anybody who had charted those waters and could tell me that it's not as intimidating, and you don't need to be a brilliant thinker to be able to understand some of that process. But
yeah, I think it's certainly something that people learn over time, where they ask, frankly, people mostly ask questions when things have gone awry. And if we were to, think about a program has some serious quality problems or management issues, we know that there are regulatory organizations that can look at those things, or funding problems that need to be fixed. And that goes outside of yourself and into government. And I think a lot of people, there's an apathy element, there's an element of self-stigmatization, that people don't know that they can stand up for themselves and not feel stigmatized by who they're meeting with or talking to about themselves
right,
being someone who used to be an addict, or even a formerly a person with psychosis. That there's a lot of people who feel, have worries about things like that. But
me too. I still
I,
have worries like that. That's why I wear this T-shirt, so I can just let you know up front. I'm worried that
well,
you're going to judge
I
me.
came back, not knowing what I would do when I came back to Seattle, and I realized that again, taking an inventory of what I'm good at and what I know I can do, or at least get started with, and look at the skills I have and where did they point me. They pointed me to looking at the legislative process, and the idea of, I know I'm good at helping people learn how to navigate that process. I know I'm good at teaching people and giving up what I know in terms of things like tips and shortcuts and um, uh, 3-minute stump speeches or elevator speeches, and helping people to get their backpack filled with what they need so that they can go in and make a difference also. I also have a lot of hope that people can together make change.
Yep.
And so I have a real spirit of not quitting on this, because um, people together can make change if they are ready to be together. I think there are a lot of people that want to make changes, but are they ready to make changes together?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
that is a struggle in many ways. And it does still have to do with what's in it for me, or what is
Right,
it to me, and how do
right,
I. And so bringing down those barriers of, what, it has nothing to do with you anymore. It
right,
actually has to do with, if you think about the round table, it has to do with
right.
and the
Well, one
people
of the
that are not,
challenges with
you know,
newcomers, and I was found it myself, is so you get a good idea, then you get the person to turn it into legislation, and then you then you tell them why this is good, and then it doesn't pass or doesn't even become a bill. You get disillusioned of, I'm never going to be able to make a difference. This goes nowhere. Don't understanding that some of these things are slow moving processes, and you're trying to, shape something that is huge, and and you're just one voice of many. And sometimes I think that, I brought people to the Oregon State Legislature to testify in support, where they supported something, and I said, well, why don't I help connect you guys to go, do it? And they were glad to do it, and then they were crestfallen after bill doesn't pass committee, failed. What's the use of doing this? After one bill that they were excited about, and I was excited about too. I sort of had the same problem of, are we ever going to get anything across the finish line?
Well, I think knowing when you're going in that incrementalism, and that's where two history is really important. And I don't know all the history of every sort of, really a whole lot of the Washington embedded history, but I know a lot about some of the services design and evidence base and that history. And I think it just comes in time. On every Tuesday night, actually, from 5:30 to 7, I host a web tour of our state legislative website, which is, because we're all remote, we're all from home. The book, the textbook, the only thing that you need is this website. And it's not the easiest website, but it also happens to be one of the best in the country. And so I'm excited about, I learned the website partially, I should say, a year ago, and it was really by a lot of stumbling and miscalculating where things were, and getting lost inside the website so many times, and calling legislative experts up in the middle of the night saying, I don't know what I'm doing here. And now being able to teach some of that, and we go on tours, and it's basically share screen, here's the website. I take questions of what people want to find, and then we go on a tour. It's also another place where people can learn who their legislators are. And because every legislator has a website on the page, in the website, you can learn about them. You can learn their biography, and you can find a couple of legislators that went to the same college or went to your school, or has a dog or a cat named after your dog and cat, and you keep that in your memory. And when you see them, you say, my dog is the same name, or whatever. But these are ways of really getting to know the people and getting to know the processes. And then it's more fun than tedious in terms of it being a very long story. I consider really all of this a long story, and that it really took the weight off when I consider it that way, because I was under pressure of, what's going to happen to this bill now that it died? What do I do? And well, the fact is that something can change with the bill between now and the next legislative session.
Right.
And so it's part of the story. And when I thought of it that way, it took all the stuff off my shoulders. It actually made it more fun than the way I was looking at it, which was really highly pressure, highly tense, highly negative. And even the story of the biographies of the legislature, people, change jobs in between sessions, or they get an award, and that's part of the story too. And they get something added to their website. So, and then also learning how to read a bill, learning how to cut to the chase, how to do a word search instead of reading the whole bill if you don't have time. Knowing when to backspace or not, which used to be my death knell, was that. And so, that kind of work, I don't want to know why. Oh, and coupled with it it's 5:30 to 7. We usually just spend 25 minutes or so on the website because it's been sort of cumulative. And by the way, I've had 97 visits.
Wow.
Which is to some degree unduplicated or duplicated, because there are a few people that have come a few times, but a lot of people again since the beginning of December. So I started it before the session began on January 11th, and we're going to go all the way through here. And
to the end of the Washington State legislative session. When is that?
at the end of April.
The end of April. What do you call this Tuesday night educational?
Well, the other part of the Tuesday night is we usually have someone just fly in through Zoom, who's actually, either a lobbyist or a content expert, an advocate, and they come and give us a little bit of tips from them.
Oh, okay.
This is what I did today. This is where I'm headed tomorrow on this bill, and they may want to get some input or they don't, but they're highly expert at what they do. And then the remaining part of the time are usually some tips around just remote testimony and submitting under other information. And we call it Tuesday nights. I'm just laughing at how obvious that would be. Tuesday nights, website tour and bills updates.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm big with wordy titles.
That's very good. That's very clear.
Yeah, we do a bill update.
So speaking of that, and particularly, engage what, the subtitle was, advocacy work and then also remote policy. So let's talk about the last 10, whenever COVID really came to Washington State.
Yeah.
And, you were moving with a group that I think that you founded or co-supported the direction of legislative policy advocates. So let's go into what has happened sort of in your remote policy engagement and understanding. And maybe there's something that folks who are trying to think maybe how they could up their game from around some of that sort of stuff around remote policy engagement during this time of Zoom everything.
Well, that's exactly what I was talking about now, was to actually, the Tuesday nights, but one thing about that was that I have no idea why I picked Tuesday, but I will tell you that that's a great night of the week because things happen on Monday and Friday, and then later, it seems like not giant things are happening on Tuesday in terms of the legislative process. That doesn't mean it won't change, but it seems like it's not a bad day. So thinking about that is a good idea. What's the best day of the week for you? I think also I developed some tips that I can send out or people can contact me. But the group that does the Tuesday nights is Washington Legislative and Advocacy, Legislative and Policy Advocates, Washington Legislative and Policy Advocates, and I'm going by the four initials, WLPA. And that, I have a Facebook page, so you're welcome to like or follow. You can see that on that page, for example, which is really the main communication, is that page. I share out to at least 35 pages around Facebook. That's not always possible, but I do what I can there. And then there's an email list that I'm happy to put you on as well. And those are only 1 or 2 emails a month. I do not email a lot. And it's all volunteer, no funding, which has not yet, there are some folks that have been helping, which is great, but then not having funding has not been a problem so far. In terms of anything I can see. I mean, actually my Zoom account is a gift, and then at some point, I'd have to look at a small grant, but I'm now not working, and I don't see the need for it. And I think it's a clean way of just being, as crystal clear as I can be. I don't know how much clearer that could be, but and then really providing people with, I was sort of stumbling around, but Washington State has some issues with its peer community, but I want to let you know that Washington Legislative and Policy Advocates has been open to anyone. So there actually have been, we've had guest speakers without when the legislative session is finished, it's year round.
Yeah.
So there's policy panels and things similar to the round table, only it's year round. And slightly different leaning in terms of the roundtable, but during the session right now, the challenges with the peer community really, and why I've decided to sort of open this up more, is is that we don't have sort of statewide clearinghouse here, a place where there are a couple of state organizations that are more focused on, quote, their disability group.
Right, right,
They're funded that way, so there can't
right,
be maybe necessarily statewide.
right.
And so as a result, in the mental health side of behavioral health, it's sort of Facebook pages that people gravitate towards, and less of a, quote, statewide organization that, for example, I would love that kind of connection where I could call on the statewide group and say, I think we need 8 people to testify.
Yeah, yeah,
Can you, can you find them?
right.
Or, and so, for example, yesterday there was a hearing on a suicide prevention hotline sort of situation, and I was able to identify kind of on my own a few people. However, you know, it was really a scramble. And I think being able to have an entity that could do that cleanly without any government funding issues, and just provide more education to peers
Yeah,
and help identify leadership so that they can come and help with testimony, because that's really urgently needed. And I don't know everyone well enough because of my tenure now back here. And I don't think it's appropriate to handpick. So I'm doing what I
yeah,
can
yeah,
to put the net out, and hopefully
right,
people and they did respond a couple days ago, which was great.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I was thinking, I agree. You're pointing about hand picking. I try to encourage, if I'm speaking or on a panel or whatever, anybody and everybody, and they don't have to agree with, we want the sidewalk painted green. No, we want it painted blue. Well, then I don't want to help you. In fact, that's not relevant even at the point is I want to help you understand part of this process that was intimidating to me, and mystifying, and also want to feel like you help you understand it so you can get engaged. And yeah, I loved your point too about it being a story instead of just a certain goal based objective that's going to happen in the next 5 months particularly. So
you won't last unless you flex up on that process.
right.
I think I've been known to sort of tends to be, pressure packed around outcomes and where the line is that I'm finished, when it really isn't a line anymore.
Yeah,
And that may come with age, it may come with experience. But talking about it that way has been a huge mental health opening for me. And I know that when I talk about it as a story with other people, they're like, oh, you're right, it is a story, and people feel more comfortable too.
yeah, they're going
Um,
to build a statue of me, for all my near misses as well as my successes as well,
yeah,
so
well,
in
and
the courtyard of the state. So
I think it's, the thing too, when you were at the very beginning of this discussion about, or the question about why people aren't more involved, and I think it's because we don't know the power that we have
right.
to help shape. There's a bill that may not go very far, or it may, actually, I'm not sure if whether it passes or it doesn't is not the point, except to say that I know that a big group of legislators are understanding the value of the peer voice
Yeah,
in the process that they're debating.
yeah,
And
yeah,
if that's all that comes out, that's a great part of the
yeah,
story.
yeah.
And I have no litmus tests in terms of getting involved, like you said, blue or green sidewalk, plaid, fine. They just want to hear you, and they want to know where you're coming from. And, frankly, that's the best way to make policy, is having that opportunity to share what you need to share.
Yeah.
And, so pro or con. Now, Washington Legislative and Policy Advocates is nonpartisan, and I forgot to mention that. And
Okay.
so typically we really believe in, health and well-being. And so there are some bills that are like life or death bills, and one of them is the new 988 system. And so I say that WLPA supports 988 because it saves lives.
Right, right.
And of course, that's going to be a bill that we're out there in front, and we're pro. And if someone is involved with the project and they're con, great. You know what I
Yep.
mean? That's certainly, there's no pressure on that. And there's another bill 1499, which is the decriminalization bill that you all, Oregon was the first to have in the
Right.
nation.
It somewhat emulates Measure 110
Yeah,
here in Oregon. Yeah.
yeah, we really looked at Oregon, at Janie Gullickson from MHAHO,
Yeah.
and what you all did there, and that's been a big part of the process in Oregon. And the other thing is really, I've been working with the ACLU on that bill, and also a coalition of criminal, the coalition of for police accountability, and two separate coalitions on two separate gigs.
Wow.
And I'll tell you that being in coalition is hugely important when you're doing this kind of work. Number one, they need you. They need your peer voices as part of your network that you
Yeah.
bring to them. But also, they have staff, they have funding, they have excellent graphics design people and videographers. And so I want to encourage people to look at that whole idea of going under a coalition and being a partner. I'm on weekly calls with them.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a lifesaver this session.
So we have, well, we're running up against our boundary, but we'll go another 10 minutes. I have some questions here. The first question, how do we stop the erosion of the peer specialist role within the traditional provider organizations?
Could you say that again? How do you
Yeah.
stop?
Yeah. How do we stop the erosion of the peer specialist role within the traditional provider organizations?
I feel like I need more specifics on what that looks like and what erosion means.
Well, but let me just try to, I'm just going to crudely sort of interpret it, what I think it means. So there are peers that are hired to work at legacy industry or big CCMA, big community mental health clinics, but it's not a peer run organization. They're doing social determinants and community support stuff. How does it, for example, one of the challenges we have in Oregon is certain amount of folks in our CRM community, the addiction peers community, have said, sometimes I'll do a junior clinician job. I'll ask a person for a UA test, or, sometimes they'll end up, giving information to the clinician that they learned in confidence discussing as a peer. And sometimes people are like, well, what happened to the fidelity of the peer if they're just being tucked into being a junior clinician? And there's a sentiment in Oregon, and I feel the same way as a lot of people do. Not that everybody believes this, but that unless these people stay true to their role and the fidelity of what the job is, then we're going to end up subsidizing junior clinicians we're just getting them a lot cheaper. And there goes the value of these people.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I got it. I understand that now. I'm not the least bit surprised that these are questions that are being asked. And I know that I don't have the answer. And I'm not surprised because it's a slippery slope. And so it's easy to see that what people talked about 25 years ago is happening now.
Yep.
And I think there was a lot of concern by people like Howie, although and also Sally to some degree, although now they have a new program in California. But I think there was a lot of concern among more of the quote veteran, peer consumer survivor leaders that these things would happen, and they are.
Yep.
And I think that the pendulum is swinging, and people need to reconcile for themselves. Well, am I here because the values, or am I here because my boss asked me to give a UA result?
Yeah.
That's somebody, and what do I do? And
Right.
how do I sleep at night?
Right.
And all those questions are pretty personal. They're personal as in their individualized decision making. And so I think that the erosion, you can call it an erosion, or we could call it, that in terms of the pendulum, that there's a new generation of peer worker. Or ultimately, I think what people thought many years ago is that all these peer workers would actually change the clinical cultural status of the non-peers.
Well, we're hoping that.
Yeah, and I just don't think there's any research on that right now. If there is, I may not be familiar with it, and that's a granted, it could be happening. But I don't know what the point of that research would be, except that yes, peers are having an impact. But I don't think that the system is, it's like towards what end? If it's about the peers taking over the system, then I'd say don't call it an erosion and call it, I guess I imagine, like those desert movies with people riding in on horses, an invasion
Yeah,
or something.
yeah, yeah.
So that's,
So here's another question. What do you say to those who doubt the power of recovery and say to you that you are very functional and obviously an exception and don't really represent the quote unquote seriously mentally ill?
yeah. And I once had a family member actually, and I'm not kidding here, come up in basically tears. And this was so long ago, too, a long, long time ago, pleading with me to tell her what medication I took so that she could tell her son to take it.
Yeah, yeah,
And it was so, I was floored.
yeah,
One, by her emotion first, and then by the question. And I was like, I don't know what to say here, but um, I think that whole question is really bonkers. It's also extremely insulting, because people don't know underneath anything. I mean, I was homeless for 2 years, right before I came back here in 12 and 13.
2012 and 2013, you were homeless in Oregon, right?
Yes, exactly. And also, obviously without medication, but for some reason I went to an emergency room 15 times. And because I quote present well,
Right.
they didn't take me in and examine me.
Yeah.
And I know it's 15 times because I got a bill,
Yeah.
which I ended up getting written off because
Yeah.
I was not going to pay. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I find it to be, people have, their own, I know at the beginning of COVID, when we didn't talk a lot about COVID, but about a few days into COVID, when we had lockdown,
Right.
I'm in an apartment and I was actually having panic attacks because not that I knew I could go out if I had to, but I was feeling I was almost feeling vulnerable to something. I was a very bizarre, and all the streets were quiet. I mean, everything was like a ghost town. And there were challenges I had during that period of time, and I did need to reach out. And so I thank God I came back and I'm in subsidized housing.
Yeah.
I love my apartment. I'm a mile from my mom, who I also rebuilt my relationship with. She was ready to hammer up missing person signs all
Right. Right.
over.
Right.
Kevin knows, because it was all within there. And so there's no answer to that question. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
It unfortunately is a question that I've been asked over again. Like you cannot, mothers have said to me, you don't know the experience my son has had and his, his, what she defined as his psychosis. You don't know how paranoid he was. You do these things and stuff. And, I'm not trying to dismiss your suffering, but this is real serious stuff. And you're obviously, a lot more functional, and that, thank you. I mean, for one hand, partially my ego or my public face, when I don't want people to know, that he's nervous, awkward, and odd, that he's just another sort of Joe Q public decent person or whatever. But also too is, well, don't put a cork in the stream of the possibility that we can have, that our process of wellness or health seeking can have valleys and peaks and lows, but that we can move progressively to a greater state of self-care and self-support and, and community.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean to be rude to whoever asked that question or say it was a bad question, but it's also a formulaic question. In other words, I have heard those very words in the same question. So it's almost like a prepackaged question. And I'm sorry for if you've got a family member that is really in bad, or tough condition, but we all are different people.
Yeah.
And we all suffer in our own ways. And, I do have, my tics, and I do have my, do you know what I mean? I
Yeah.
have,
Yeah.
I have my issues,
Yeah.
and,
I
and
mean,
we
if
all
anybody
do.
wants to hear my 4-hour story of heartbreak, failure, loss, grief, you know,
And now love,
yeah, yes,
love.
that's right. Yeah.
I'm so
We
glad to have been here, Kevin. Thank you so
Yes, well, I
much.
think, one of the things you can teach people how to be effective, lobbyists or do effective system advocacy. But one of the things that I just admire you, and I just probably think it's just an innate gift that you have, is one, your warmth to others, to whether they're above you or below you in the political theater of trying to move stuff. I mean, not that that's how the world is ordered, but in the political world, there's a lot of kissing up the food chain to the VIPs and then the volunteers or the lesser knowns. Your warmth and your professionalism to everybody, who, whether they see you as an equal, you treat people as an equal. And two, your ability to take complex and sophisticated concepts in the policy and political, legislative world, and chop that up in a way that's accessible and understandable and
Thank
comprehensive.
you.
Just brilliant. And then also too is just you just emanate, I want to be this person's friend. When I first met you, I thought this person has a natural social charisma and intelligence that, one, doesn't seem performative, two, doesn't seem to be faked, and and three, seems deeply warm and empathetic. And I just love you terrifically as my friend, and also who I learned from in all of your legislative, and the things that you do, your community building up there in the great state of
Thank
Washington.
you. I love you, Kevin. And I do want to say too that your sense of humor, and I want you to know too that you have been a very big support, and your smile, um, a big support with legislative and policies work, that when you have those things before you in Oregon, we have had amazing conversations about our respective bills, our strategies, or you ask for advice about a strategy or vice versa. And so I've really been excited about being near a state,
Yeah. Yeah.
in Oregon, and to have another person doing, I think, basically some of the same work.
Yeah. Well,
So
it's
it's
interesting if you look across the 50 states, except the huge ones like California and Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York, save for the really large ones. We're 4.1 million or 5.2 million. And there's a lot of states like that have around our approximate size that have nothing, that have never ever thought that the local peer group downtown Wichita is going to, just use that example, are going to become sophisticated policy. People say to me, "Oh, you're a volunteer? Really? Are you a volunteer? I'm not sure that you're volunteer. No one's paying me. I struggle 4 days out of 7, so I keep odd hours, and I'm not always available due to the challenges I have. But the game. I think in some ways we're pioneers. People used to always talk at these national conferences about lobby day, and one of the things that I just watching you and learning about what you were doing, like, so much of what happens with some of the federal funds, but the direction of that happens in the 50, we need a 50 state peer movement strategy, because so much happens in decision making at the state legislature. So
Yeah, that was definitely what the intent was a long time ago. I'm not sure where things are headed now, but it certainly makes sense. And speaking of that too, I do want to say that I'm involved with my local political party,
oh, okay.
and I'm a precinct PCO, precinct committee organizer or
Oh,
officer.
wow.
And I'm one of several hundred in my legislative district,
Yeah.
hundreds. And we have monthly calls with the party. I'm learning a huge amount
Yeah.
from, and that political angle, if that's really all you do, is a great place to start too. I
I
have a
just left.
neighborhood of 500 or 600 people that are, quote, my voters.
Yep.
I ran for the office
Oh,
and
wow.
won in November. And I had,
I'm the same. I'm a precinct person here in my district. Have been for the last 8 years.
oh, right on.
One of the things,
I knew you were actually. I knew you were. Yeah.
and now I have my representative's, personal cell phone number, so I can text him on Saturday night. I actually gave him one of these singing Christmas light bulbs, and he said, I can't get the thing to shut up. It's singing Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, and it won't stop. What am I going to do? One of the things that I wish that the last question for me, and I think so much of telling the story is building relationships and getting network and having access to provide people with information at the right time to be able to provide that information. And some of that has been, I have 5 legislators, we have 60 representatives, and 30 senators. I think there's 5 Oregon state legislators that I have their personal cell phone, and they have given me permission to say, if you're watching a bill and it's going to be in a hearing and the hearing's about ready to start, feel free to shoot me really brief talking point or 2, not more than 2 sentences, during the hearing or right before the hearing. How do I only have 5 so far, Laura? I need every single legislator, at least everybody on the Behavioral Health Committee on the Senate and the House side, to say, Kevin, we trust you. We think you're eloquent. We think you're representing these values, and we believe in your mission. So if we want to fill me in, here's my private cell phone number. Text me whenever whenever I'm in hearing. How do you do that? I've never, because it's happened.
Well, I guess
volunteered it and said it to me, but I'm uncomfortable saying to him, can I have your private cell phone number? I'd like to keep you informed.
Well, this is my philosophy, actually. And that is that, and this goes to sort of the art of political work. And that is that you have an email address too. Let me finish. You have an email address too. And your legislator, whichever House or representative, also has a legislative aide or an assistant, legislative assistant. And that's every person has an office and a legislative aide, if not a couple of other people working in their offices. And so my advice always is to email the legislator, copy the legislative aide or assistant, and then 2 people.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's really what it's about. It's about multiplying your connections and your relationships. And so, yeah, it's great to have a cell phone, because then if you, I thought I saw a flag go by, but it wasn't. And then you can text and let them know, I need this information, or I'm about to go on duty. I'm about to go at the hearing. And you don't know if they're going to see it or watch it or say anything, but if so in a way, I guess that's my philosophy, is actually use those numbers use those numbers, only as needed, only PRN, as we used to say. And because then you burn that contact if you're either always texting or, you're texting the right thing, but it's too many times,
Right.
So I just would recommend that. I think also every contact should result in another contact.
Yeah.
It is really about organizing. And for example, I had legislative assistants as guest speakers too, of them who've worked for different people as guest speakers.
Yeah.
And we learned about what they do and what they know and what they're able to help with. And I'm telling you, the young, bright, amazing people that work for the legislators, who by the time they were done giving their talks were telling us, if you need anything, let me know.
Yeah.
I mean, they were really amazing. And they're the folks that actually get things done. So in so many, not everything, but certainly in some very fundamental basic ways. And they could alert your legislator that you're about to go up to the microphone or what have you. So I don't know it. I think it's good though, if you have them as contacts already, that to definitely keep them as cell phone numbers.
One of the things I found with legislative agents, aides here in Oregon, was how many of them were not familiar that there are, that there is a peer movement, that the state's been funding peer services and for quite a while now, that there's a certification program, that large agencies are hiring significant amount of peers, that there's peer-run organizations that are growing, and
They do to some degree here because one person actually does some volunteer work with the disability community,
Oh, okay.
and they're both on career paths. They're
Well, I
both,
had legislative aides tell me right after I told them this peer respite bill is going to save lives and save money and change people's course of direction of understanding self-care and mutual support. And they were like, oh, wow. And then they self-identified to me as I was leaving, like, wow, this is so cool. Who are you again? Wow, I never heard of this. Wow, wow, wow.
Yeah.
And, in the world of industry and commercial lobbying and slickness and 10-point PowerPoint discussions where it's all bulletproof and professional, relationships of warmth and understanding, and also the coming to the table saying, I'm like in Moby Dick, I alone live to tell the tale. I've been through some of these grinders, and so that's what motivates me.
Yeah.
And,
Well, keep it up, bro.
well, you too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We went a little bit over, but I thought it was very important to get into some of this stuff. This is great. And so, yeah, I appreciate what you said about Howie the Harp. There's some, we could do a whole discussion on, first generation folks like Judy Chamberlain, Sally Zinman, Cookie Grant, David Oakes, a whole bunch of folks,
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, it is Saturday afternoon, and we are going to sign off, and we will see you guys next week. Thanks again, Laura Van Tosh.
Thank you so much. Okay.